Hey, how's everybody doing today? I'm Anthony. You're watching Palmetto Prepared, and today we're going to have a conversation about rationing. And when I say rationing, I'm not talking about personal at your own home kind of rationing. I'm talking about government mandated rationing. Now, we haven't seen this on a grand scale since the 70s with the gas shortage, but even before then, the one I really wanted to hit on was during World War II. Now, for those of you that understand and know what rationing is, even some of you that were alive during it, you already know what it is. Those of you that are in the younger generations, like myself, who have never had to experience it, may not understand exactly what rationing is. Now, rationing is basically the government telling you that you can only get so much of a certain item per week, per month. All right? Regardless of how much money you have, the capitalistic principle of supply and demand does not matter. There's only so much that each person is going to be allotted. So let me go ahead and get into examples of what I'm talking about. During World War II, people were asked to make sacrifices. Now, the reason why this is so important, and I will get to it at the end, is because back then everyone had to kind of pitch together for the war effort. Meaning that the everyday average family, someone who may not actually be physically in the war, still had to support the war at home. That means having to give up on certain luxuries or whatnot to make sure that the war effort does not go impeded by shortages. So the government back in 1941, FDR signed an executive order creating the OPA or OPA, the Office of Price Administration. Basically, the job of this was to place a ceiling on pricing for most goods and to limit consumption by instituting rationing. Obviously, rationing is a system that you can only buy so many goods at one time. Now, excuse me. The first books were mailed out in the spring of 1942, and the first thing that was actually rationed was sugar, meaning you had to actually open up your ration book that was mailed out, and you had to present a stamp to your local grocer, and you could only buy as much sugar as your stamp would allow, whether that be 1 pound, 4 pounds, whatever, during for the course of a week or a month. You had so many points, either red stamp or blue stamp. We're not going to get into the semantics of that. But the main thing I wanted to hit on here was you're only allowed and allotted to buy a certain amount of product through a certain time frame. Now, one of the main things that a good example is meats. The shortages for meat, because let's face it, back then we didn't have quite the food technology we do today in the factory farms, that kind of thing. Not to mention, since the world was at war, trade was severely impacted. So we had an extremely hard time feeding not only ourselves as the people in the country, but the war effort, not to mention other countries that were completely 100% at war and could not feed themselves. So we had to make sure that we rationed enough meats to go around for us, them. Now, what that meant was meat was basically cut down to 2.5 pounds per adult per week. Now, I don't know about y'all, but I can go out to a restaurant right now and eat 1.5 pounds of steak in one sitting. So having 2.5 pounds of meat per week per person is absolutely incredibly low. Obviously, we live in a society these days where it's just always there. We don't have to think about this. So that's why I wanted to use that as my first example to kind of at least prove my point that government rationing way back when, it didn't matter how much money you had. It mattered about, can you conserve and make this work? That's why things like meatloaf were really popular back then, because you could stretch the length of ground beef by adding oats, breadcrumbs, that kind of thing, to make a full meal with only using 1/2 pound or a pound to feed your entire family. That way everybody could eat, still get their nutrient requirement, that kind of thing, but you're not killing yourself and using up all your meat in one day or one sitting. So other items that were rationed were butter, canned milk. Canned milk was more for the pregnant mothers, because since mothers really needed it, they wanted to make sure that it was always going to be there. So that's why they rationed it specifically for them. Coffee, dried fruits, jams, jellies, lard, shortening, oils, gasoline, fuel oil, kerosene, shoes because of rubber. Rubber is one of those things I wanted to mention is because we we can't make our own rubber, so we had to do it, import it from the Indies and down in Indonesia and stuff. Well, guess who had control of that? The Japanese. So obviously we couldn't import rubber, so we had to ration rubber, and that's why people were giving up shoes and not be able to buy shoes, because the rubber soles and silk nylon for parachutes. Now, the reason why I'm bringing all this stuff up and why I think it's so important to my channel now is for two reasons. First things first, we live in a society of excess where people do not have any clue what it means to conserve. Now, those on a lower end of the financial, spectrum, your lower class and your lower middle class, your working class, they understand what it means to have a budget. Not all of them, but a lot of them have an understanding of what it means to have a budget. There are a lot of people out there, though, that think that just because they can afford something, it's always going to be there. And that's not the case. When it comes down to rationing, government mandated rationing, it didn't matter how much money you actually had. If you could afford it, it didn't really matter, because there was a certain price put on things so everybody could get some. It wasn't that price gouging whatever if you could only afford it. Which is why I wanted to inject that into this conversation, because if you've never had to conserve something before, you're going to keep using it. So you might want to think about your habits now of what you kind of go overboard in buying. If you do consume so much of whatever, imagine if that was put on a ration, what would you do? And the second thing I wanted to hit on here was, we are in an unprecedented, 10 years now of government expansion in our economy. Now, I have my own arguments about all that, but let's just avoid the whole elephant in the room in terms of bond market and rates or whatever. But eventually it's going to come down to a time where we're in another recession, point blank. And when you're in a recession, there's two ways to usually get out of a recession, and that's lower the federal funds rate, lowering interest rates, kind of injecting a whole bunch of money into the market so people can buy things and bring the economy back up. But we never were able to rebound after the last one. Everybody got used to easy money, quick, interest-free money or low interest money, that we never recovered the way we should have. And we never raised the rates back to where they could have been to avoid going into another recession. So the Federal Reserve doesn't quite have that cushion below them to lower rates and inject more money. Now it's all quantitative easing, meaning printing money, making inflation worse. What that means now is, if we do hit another recession, there's only really one way to get out of it. Unfortunately, war. War creates jobs and makes a lot of people spend a whole bunch of money. So it really wouldn't surprise me. Now, I'm not saying that's going to happen, but it really wouldn't surprise me if that ends up happening somewhere. Not necessarily the United States, but war will happen somewhere, regardless of whatnot. And I wouldn't be surprised if it did break out and the 5 countries that are on the Security Council are not on the same page. Let's just say that. So, United States, France, the UK, Russia, and China. Do you really think they're going to be on the same side again? Because I don't think so. And we're most likely going to be to a point where, if the world does kind of go into war again, we're going to be instituting some sort of rationing again. Now, again, I'm not saying this is going to happen. I'm merely offering a what-if scenario. So if this does happen, are you kind of prepared to absorb that? So when it comes down to things that were rationed, gasoline, oils, foods, all that fun stuff, can you absorb that? Are you ready to absorb that? So think about the things that you consume. Think about ways that you can bypass the system. Can you make your own? So, like, one of the big things during World War II was victory gardens. The government actually encouraged people to have their own victory garden, meaning you go out in your backyard, you plant a big garden, you have rabbits, you have chickens, to be able to subsidize your own food instead of buying it. To the point where, actually in 1943, the government estimated that there's 20 million victory farms or victory gardens. So let's just say, like, people aren't in that ability. People don't have the ability to do that anymore. How about that? With the rise of suburbs and apartments and condo living, the amount of space required to have a victory garden, a lot of people don't even have room to put a row of plants on, like, a deck. Some people can't grow anything outside because they have no space. So we could be in a very difficult situation if we can't do our own victory gardens because of space. Now I have 5 acres, so I can do everything all day. But a lot of people, like I said, do live in apartments and condos, and they cannot grow a victory garden. So they might be the ones that are in the biggest amount of trouble, which is why you need to start thinking now of how you can absorb a ration if you do happen to have one that's instigated. So, again, I'm not trying to scare anybody. That's the last thing I want to do. I just want to kind of open up your mind to the idea and the thought that there might be another government-instituted ration, government-mandated ration, and you can't do anything about that. So, in order to avoid starving or being put into a lot of hardship, what are things that you can do now to avoid all of that? So, kind of putting in the systems while everything's good, that's the whole point of prepping, right? So we can build our supplies now for when we need them, we're good to go. All right, no, we didn't start building when it was raining. So that's all I have to say. If you like this video, please give me a thumbs up. If you haven't subscribed to my channel, please subscribe. I'd love to have you here as a subscriber, and I will catch y'all later, all right?